Welcome and thanks for having me present. Today I'm going to discuss zircon coupled dissolution precipitation replacement processes, or CDP replacement for short, in granulites that occur during reaction between melt and zircon. This research was done with my collaborators Sandra Piazzolo, Jacqueline Halpin and Isra Ezad, and our PhD and master students. I will present results from 3 piston cylinder melt-zircon reaction experiments, along with 2 natural examples of melt-zircon reaction in Cretaceous granulites of Fiordland, New Zealand, and another example from the high-grade Mawson-Charnockite orthogneiss of East Antarctica. For the first part of the presentation, I briefly review the process of coupled dissolution precipitation replacement, then run through the experimental and natural case studies, highlighting the similar microstructural and microchemical signatures that form during zircon CDP replacement. The first key message of this presentation is that melt-zircon reaction drives CDP replacement. As seen in this example of zircon from the Mawson-Charnockite orthogneiss, this process is inferred by microstructures, such as modified and truncated internal cathodoluminescence response, along with dissolution textures at grain boundaries that modify original zircon grain facets, seen here on the Tamura reference zircon. The most diagnostic microstructures are micro to nanoscale mineral inclusions and porosity, best observed with ultra-high resolution imaging using a field emission gun, SEM. The second key message is that trace elements are variably mobilized by melt-zircon reaction, and the CDP replacement process potentially redistributes elements within a grain, or it can add them or take them away from a grain. This occurs during CDP and depends on the connectivity or permeability of the fluid through the porosity formed in the replaced domains. The porosity also makes the replaced domains more susceptible to younger element mobility and lead loss compared to structurally intact primary zircon domains. The incomplete loss and variable mobility of radiogenic lead forms complex spot date arrays that smear along concordia. The other trace elements are also mobilized, and a common feature observed is the depletion in zircon rare earth element content. The final key message of this presentation is that the experiments show that all the microstructural and microchemical changes in zircon can happen rapidly, in hours to days. The process of CDP replacement needs to be contrasted with volume diffusion, because researchers who use geochronology think about closure temperatures of an isotopic system based on volume diffusion experiments. Volume diffusion happens in the absence of a fluid. It has high activation energies and therefore only happens at high temperatures. The rates are quite low for most silicates and the components move via the crystal lattice, while there's no destruction of the framework. In contrast, for the mineral replacement reaction process CDP, the fluid lowers activation energies, and CDP is very fast. And it involves the 3 steps of dissolving, transporting over variable scales, and then precipitation. In the case of zircon replacement, the scales of transport of trace elements such as radiogenic lead are important in whether the age of the replaced domain of zircon is reset or experiences variable lead loss. The cartoon shows that chemical communication happens through the micro to nanoporosity in the replaced domain. If the connectivity is high, then there's a good chance the radiogenic lead and or trace elements like the rare earths can escape, and we might reset the age of our rim domain and change its trace element chemistry. If that connectivity is low, then the replaced zircon domain partially inherits the old trace element signature and inherits the old uranium-lead character of the precursor grain. As such, the age does not reset to 0, even though the crystal lattice has been broken down and regrown. So melt-zircon reaction is one way to form these spot date arrays smeared along concordia. This figure summarizes the microstructural progression of zircon coupled dissolution precipitation replacement, where a precursor zircon xenocrest is entrained in a magma. Melt-zircon reaction drives dissolution at grain boundaries, shown by the red. Modification and truncation of internal textures are usually best observed in cathodoluminescence. And inherent to the process of CDP is the formation of this nano to microscale porosity. Upon cooling and formation of the final microstructures, the melt field porosity can crystallize zircon or epigenetic inclusions, partly healing the modified grain. We reacted fragments of the mud tank reference zircon with natural intermediate and mafic melts at high pressure and high temperature for 24 hours. We observed dissolution textures at grain fragment boundaries and dissolution channels cutting across the fragments, in addition to porosity trails. These dissolution channels and porosity trails, they coincide with brighter cathodoluminescence response and also a shift in the Raman spectra in the modified domains. The reacted mud tank zircon fragments showed variable proportions of glass inclusions, from very low, where we interpret preservation of primary zircon that did not react with the melt, to quite high, where we interpret higher proportions of replaced zircon. Therefore, the ablation volume during laser analysis included variable proportions of zircon and glass, depending on where we targeted the laser. There is of course also a 3D effect, where there may be more or less glass inclusions below the polished surface image that are then ablated. On a log-log graph, the trace element data from the 3 experiments form distinct mixing arrays between the unmodified mud tank zircon at low titanium and low lanthanum concentrations, and the glass composition in each experiment at high titanium and high lanthanum concentrations. The mixing arrays allow us to estimate the proportion of glass inclusions in each ablation volume, which are mostly less than 5 to 10%, but note that the highest analysis contains 25% glass. 25 laser spot dates on zircon domains with very low glass inclusions return a weighted average age close to the published age of the mud tank reference standard. This is consistent with these domains not having reacted much with the melt. 38 laser spot dates on zircon domains with higher trace element concentrations, indicative of ablation volumes with variable proportions of glass inclusions. These are spread over 100 million years, from about 750 MA to 650 MA. The 2 younger spot dates have trace element concentrations that suggest ablation of as little as 0.6% glass and as high as 25% glass inclusions. These young apparent spot dates can only be explained by a combination of mixing in some of the isotopic character of the ablated glass inclusions and up to about 10% lead loss from the replaced zircon domain. We observed the rapid development of these key microstructures of CDP replacement in our melt-zircon reaction experiments. These microstructures and the complex age data formed in our experiment within 24 hours. And if this were a natural sample, various interpretations might use the oldest, or median, or youngest statistically valid populations. The oldest population would closely estimate the protolith age, whereas the median and youngest populations are geologically meaningless. In fact, this spread of near concordant ages over about 100 million years formed in our experiments in one day, and so great care needs to be taken with these spot date arrays in natural samples. These arrays are possibly not informative on the duration of metamorphism. Moving to the first natural case study of granulites from Fiordland, New Zealand. These involve gneissic circa 131 MA gabbros that are cut about 10 million years later by spectacular grid pattern of thin feldspar-rich dikes with adjacent garnet reaction zones that formed in a melt rock reaction halo. The circa 131 MA zircon in the gabbro and the circa 123 MA zircon in the dike are relatively pristine in terms of microstructures, suggesting that they haven't been particularly modified. But what about zircon in the garnet reaction zones? What were the effects of melt-zircon reaction there? Zircon uranium-lead geochronology for the gabbro gneiss and the dikes is simple, forming 2 concordant clusters of spot dates shown in blue and yellow. The rare earth element patterns of zircon from the dikes are depleted in heavy rare earth elements and have less of a negative europium anomaly compared to the host gabbro gneiss. The depletion in heavy rare earth elements is likely due to co-crystallization of garnet in the dikes, competing for those heavy rare earth elements. Zircon grains from the garnet reaction zones show highly irregular shapes, consistent with dissolution of parts of grains. Internal to the zircon, there is spectacular preservation of fine porosity that is distributed, and also coarser porosity in trails. Some pores are filled with epigenetic mineral inclusions. Uranium-lead geochronology indicates that zircon in the garnet reaction zones have spot dates that are smeared over about 15 million years, between the ages of the original gabbro and the dikes. Rare earth element patterns of zircon from the garnet reaction zones overlap the precursor gabbroic gneiss data with subtle depletion in the heavy rare earth elements, again possibly due to the growth of garnet locally. The gabbroic gneiss and garnet granulite reaction zones are deformed and hydrated within narrow, meter-scale high-strain zones of melphorite. These are high-strain zones where there was influx and migration of an external melt through the high-strain zone. The external melt reacted with the precursor granulites and converted them to amphibolite. At the microscale, these melphorite high-strain zones show abundant microstructural indicators of the former presence of melt, such as very elongate grains or films that may terminate with apparent low dihedral angles. The microstructures, coupled with extensive hydration to amphibolite, indicate migration and reactive flow of a hydrous melt, was key in forming these melphorite high-strain zones. What were the effects then of this melt migration in melt-zircon reaction within the melphorite zones? The largest of these melphorite high-strain zones is 30 to 40 metres wide, and rather than amphibolite, it is dominated by hornblendite. Panels B, C and D show the progressive replacement of the earlier formed rocks towards the high-strain zone and into the high-strain zone. We examined the effects of melt-zircon reaction in both the narrow amphibolite melphorite zones and also these wider hornblendite melphorite zones. Zircon grains from the melphorite high-strain zones show highly irregular shapes, consistent with dissolution of parts of the grains from multiple sides. The surface of these dissolved regions shows a pitted texture that connects to internal microstructures that include fine porosity in trails. The most extremely modified zircon grains from the melphorite high-strain zones are crisscrossed by many dissolution channels. In between these channels, throughout the whole grain, there is spectacular preservation of fine porosity that is distributed and in trails. Some pores are filled with epigenetic mineral inclusions. Uranium-lead geochronology indicates that most of the zircon in the melphorite high-strain zones have complex spot dates that are smeared over about 25 million years and show some evidence for incorporation of common lead. The rare earth element patterns of zircon from the melphorite high-strain zones are strongly depleted in heavy rare earth elements, as shown by the grey Group 1 data. I'll show you the Group 2 data next. The grey data are here at the bottom. In addition to that data, we identified 6 grains with older spot dates up to 600 million years, and interpret that the hydrous melt migrating through the high-strain zones carried xenocrysts with it, and impregnated some of these foreign zircon grains into the melphorite high-strain zones as it passed through. Rare earth element patterns from the older xenocrysts, shown in green, have typical rare earth element patterns. Finishing up with the second natural case study of the Mawson Charnockite orthogneiss from Antarctica, our research published in 2012 used a conventional analytical strategy of ablating one spot per grain, and we identified a 500 million year spread of near concordant spot dates. Back then, we interpreted the oldest grain to represent a minimum crystallization age of the Charnockite protolith, and the spread to have formed by diffusional lead loss during subsequent granulite facies orogenic events. However, we now recognise that these zircons have all the microstructural signatures of CDP replacement. Our PhD student John analysed multiple spots per grain after carefully distinguishing domains of different porosity density. As an example, this grain, where you can see the 2012 spot in the middle there, from the study of Halpin et al., was analysed with 7 new spot analyses based on the distribution of porosity. The 8 spot dates spread over 500 million years from within the one grain, where the younger spot dates have lower rare earth element contents and are from domains with the highest density of micro to nano porosity. Across the experimental and natural case studies of melt-zircon reaction, we see consistent microstructural and microchemical signatures. Some open questions remain for the Mawson-Charnockite orthogneiss that John is still investigating. Are these zircons xenochrous from the granulite source rocks that were carried up by the magma, or are these zircons primary magmatic grains that were subsequently modified? Answering these questions allows us to understand whether the melt-zircon reaction took place in the granulite facies source region, during the partial melting, or in the magma chamber, or even during later granulite facies orogenesis. Thank you for listening. This final slide reiterates our key messages, and I'll take questions.